The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. A man in his late 30s, tall and well-built, was walking home from the grocery store. He carried a single bag of groceries in one hand, his posture straight, his movements deliberate. His demeanor was calm, but there was a quiet intensity about him, the kind that comes from years of discipline and training. He was an ex-Marine, though nothing about his appearance screamed it. He wore a simple t-shirt, jeans, and a pair of sneakers, blending in with the everyday folks around him. As he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed a police cruiser slowly rolling down the road. The car's windows were down, and he could see two officers inside, scanning the area. He didn't think much of it at first. He'd seen cops patrolling the neighborhood before. But something felt different this time. The cruiser slowed down as it approached him, and one of the officers leaned out the window. "Hey, you," the officer called out, his tone sharp. "Where are you headed?" The man stopped walking and turned to face the officers. He kept his expression neutral, his hands visible. "Just heading home," he replied calmly, lifting the grocery bag slightly. "Got some things to put away." The officers exchanged a glance, and the cruiser came to a full stop. Both officers stepped out of the vehicle, their hands resting on their belts. The taller officer, who had spoken first, took a few steps closer. "Mind if we ask what's in the bag?" he asked, though it didn't sound much like a question. The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure. Just some groceries. Milk, bread, a few other things." He opened the bag slightly, showing the contents. The officer peered inside, then looked back at his partner. "You live around here?" the second officer asked, his tone less confrontational but still wary. "Yes, just a few blocks away," the man replied, pointing down the street. "Been living here for about 2 years now." The taller officer crossed his arms. "Mind if we see some ID?" The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. The officer took it, studied it for a moment, then handed it back. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" the officer said, his tone now carrying a hint of suspicion. The man shook his head. "No, this is my home. Like I said, I've been here for 2 years." The officers exchanged another glance, and the taller one stepped closer again. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. You fit the description of someone we're looking for." The man raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity? What kind of activity?" "That's not your concern," the officer snapped. "We're just doing our job. Now, if you don't mind, we're going to need to search you." The man's calm demeanor didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disbelief, maybe even a hint of anger. He took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "All right. But I'd like to know why I'm being searched. I haven't done anything wrong." The taller officer stepped forward, his hand now resting on his holster. "We'll decide if you've done anything wrong. Now, turn around and put your hands on the car." The man hesitated for a moment, then complied. He set the grocery bag on the ground and turned around, placing his hands on the hood of the cruiser. The second officer began patting him down, his movements brisk and impersonal. As the search continued, a few neighbors began to gather on their porches, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered to each other, others simply stared. The man could feel their eyes on him, but he kept his focus on the officers. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. The second officer finished the pat-down and stepped back. "He's clean," he said to his partner. The taller officer didn't look satisfied. "What about the bag?" he asked, nodding toward the grocery bag on the ground. The man turned around slowly, his hands still raised. "It's just groceries," he said again, his voice steady but firm. "You can check it if you want." The officer picked up the bag and rummaged through it, pulling out the items one by one. Milk, bread, a box of cereal, a few cans of soup. Nothing out of the ordinary. He dropped the items back into the bag and handed it to the man. "All right," the officer said, his tone still sharp. "You're free to go. But keep in mind, we'll be watching this area. Any trouble, and we'll be back." The man took the bag and nodded. "Understood," he said simply. He turned and began walking down the street, his pace steady but unhurried. He could feel the officer's eyes on his back as he walked away, but he didn't look back. As he reached his house and unlocked the door, he set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and let out a long breath. He stood there for a moment, staring at the bag, his mind racing. He had faced far worse in his life, combat zones, life-or-death situations, but this felt different. This was his home, his neighborhood. And yet, in that moment, he had felt like a stranger. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the encounter had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had served his country, risked his life, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal in his own community. As he put the groceries away, he couldn't help but wonder how many others had experienced something similar. How many others had been stopped, searched, questioned, simply because of the color of their skin. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the end of the story. Not for him, and not for anyone else who had ever been in his shoes. And as he closed the fridge and turned off the kitchen light, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let this moment define him, but he wouldn't forget it either. He would keep moving forward, keep standing tall, no matter what challenges came his way. Because that's what he had been trained to do. That's who he was. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something had shifted, something had changed. And he knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. The next morning, the man woke up early, as he always did. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft light through the curtains of his small but tidy home. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, running a hand over his closely cropped hair. The events of the previous evening were still fresh in his mind, like a wound that hadn't quite healed. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering frustration, and stood up. He went through his usual routine: shower, dress, make coffee, but his mind kept drifting back to the encounter with the officers. It wasn't the first time he'd been stopped by the police, but it was the first time it had happened in his own neighborhood. He had always tried to keep a low profile, to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to himself. But no matter how hard he tried, it seemed like he couldn't escape the suspicion that followed him wherever he went. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced out the window at the quiet street. A few kids were riding their bikes, and an elderly woman was walking her dog. It was a peaceful scene, one that should have made him feel at ease. But instead, he felt a growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the officers from last night were still out there, waiting for him to make a wrong move. He finished his coffee and grabbed his keys, deciding to go for a walk to clear his head. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air hit his face, and he took a deep breath, trying to relax. He walked down the street, nodding politely to the neighbors he passed. Some nodded back, while others avoided his gaze. He tried not to let it bother him, but he couldn't help but wonder if they had seen what happened last night, if they now saw him differently. As he turned the corner, he saw the police cruiser parked at the end of the street. His heart skipped a beat, but he kept walking, his pace steady. He told himself not to look, not to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had gotten to him. But as he got closer, he couldn't help but glance in their direction. The same two officers were sitting in the car, watching him. He kept walking, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He could feel their eyes on him, but he refused to look back. He told himself to stay calm, to not let them see how much their presence affected him. But inside, he was seething. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here they were, treating him like a criminal. As he reached the end of the block, he heard the cruiser's engine start up. He tensed, but kept walking. The car pulled up beside him, and the window rolled down. "Morning," the taller officer said, his tone casual but with an edge to it. "Out for a walk?" The man stopped and turned to face the officer. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "Just getting some fresh air." The officer nodded, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the man up and down. "You know, it's not a good idea to be out walking alone this early. You never know what kind of trouble you might run into." The man clenched his fists, but kept his expression neutral. "I'm just taking a walk," he said again. "I'm not looking for any trouble." The officer smirked. "Well, trouble has a way of finding people like you. Just be careful, all right?" The man didn't respond. He simply nodded and turned away, continuing his walk. He could feel the officer's eyes on his back as he walked away, but he didn't look back. He kept his head high, his shoulders straight, refusing to let them see how much their words had affected him. As he walked, his mind raced. He knew he couldn't let this go on. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly feeling like he was being watched. He had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. He thought about his time in the Marines, about the discipline and the training that had shaped him into the man he was today. He had faced far worse than this, and he had always come out on top. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't enemies he could fight. This was his home, his community, and he didn't know how to fight back without making things worse. As he reached his house, he took a deep breath and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He knew he couldn't let this define him, but he also knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to find a way to stand up for himself, to show the officers, and anyone else who doubted him, that he wasn't someone to be underestimated. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him. He stood in the quiet of his living room, his mind still racing. He knew he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. All he knew was that he couldn't let this go on. He had to find a way to fight back, to reclaim his dignity, to show the world that he was more than just a stereotype. And as he sat down on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let this moment break him. He would find a way to stand tall, to fight back, to show the world who he really was. Because he was more than just an ex-Marine. He was a man, a human being, and he deserved to be treated with respect. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But he also knew that he was ready. He had faced worse, and he had come out on top. And he would do it again, no matter what it took. Because that's who he was. That's what he had been trained to do. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The man spent the rest of the day trying to focus on his usual tasks, but his mind kept drifting back to the morning's encounter. The officer's words echoed in his head, their tone dripping with thinly veiled hostility. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he was overthinking it, but the weight of their suspicion lingered like a shadow. By late afternoon, he realized he couldn't just sit around and let this eat at him. He needed to do something, something that would make it clear he wasn't going to be intimidated. He sat at his kitchen table, a notebook open in front of him, and began jotting down ideas. He wasn't the type to make rash decisions. His military training had taught him to think things through, to plan carefully before taking action. He knew that reacting impulsively could make things worse, so he forced himself to stay calm and methodical. One option was to file a complaint with the police department. He had the officers' badge numbers memorized, and he knew the exact time and location of both encounters. But he also knew how these things usually went. Complaints from people like him often got buried, dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Still, it was a start. At the very least, it would create a paper trail, something that could be referenced if things escalated. Another option was to reach out to his community. He wasn't particularly close with his neighbors, but he knew a few of them by name. Maybe if he shared his experience, others would come forward with their own stories. There was strength in numbers, and if enough people spoke up, maybe the department would be forced to take notice. But he also knew that not everyone would be willing to get involved. Fear of retaliation was a powerful deterrent. As he weighed his options, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from an old friend from his Marine days. They hadn't spoken in a while, but the timing felt almost too perfect. He picked up the phone and read the message. "Hey, man. Just checking in. How's life on the outside treating you?" He hesitated for a moment, then typed a reply, "Could be better. Dealing with some stuff. You got a minute to talk?" Within seconds, his phone rang. He answered, and the familiar voice on the other end brought a small sense of relief. They talked for a while, catching up on life, but eventually, the conversation turned to what had been bothering him. He explained the situation, careful to keep his tone neutral, but his frustration seeped through. His friend listened quietly, then said, "Man, that's messed up. But you know how it is. Some people just can't see past their own biases. You've got to stand your ground, but you've got to be smart about it. Don't give them a reason to come after you." The man nodded, even though his friend couldn't see him. "I know. I don't want to let this slide, but I don't want to make things worse either." "You've got a good head on your shoulders," his friend said. "Trust your instincts. And if you need backup, you know where to find me." The call ended, and the man felt a little more grounded. His friend's words had reminded him of something important: he wasn't alone. He had people in his corner, people who understood him and had his back. That knowledge gave him a renewed sense of determination. By the time evening rolled around, he had made a decision. He would start by filing a formal complaint with the police department. It might not lead to anything, but it was a step he needed to take for his own peace of mind. He also decided to reach out to a local community organization that focused on civil rights. They might be able to offer guidance or support, and they could help him connect with others who had faced similar situations. As he sat down at his computer to draft the complaint, he felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, frustration, but also a quiet resolve. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent. He had spent years serving his country, fighting for principles like justice and equality. Now, it was time to fight for those same principles in his own life. He typed out the details of the encounters, keeping his tone factual and professional. He didn't exaggerate or embellish, he simply laid out what had happened and how it had made him feel. When he was done, he read it over, made a few edits, and saved the document. He would print it out and deliver it to the station in the morning. As he shut down his computer and prepared for bed, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. He had taken the first step, and that was something. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew he had done the right thing. And for now, that was enough. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, and he knew there would be challenges. But he also knew he was ready. He had faced worse, and he had come out stronger. And he would do it again, no matter what it took. Because that's who he was. That's what he had been trained to do. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The next morning, the man woke up early again, his mind already focused on the task ahead. He dressed carefully, choosing a button-up shirt and slacks to present himself professionally. He printed out the complaint he had drafted the night before, placed it in a folder, and headed to the police station. The walk was short, but it felt longer than usual, each step heavy with anticipation. When he arrived at the station, he paused outside for a moment, taking a deep breath. The building loomed in front of him, its brick walls and tinted windows giving it an imposing feel. He reminded himself why he was there, not to pick a fight, but to stand up for himself and for what was right. With that thought, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The station was busy, with officers and civilians moving about, phones ringing, and the low hum of conversation filling the air. He approached the front desk, where a uniformed officer was seated, typing on a computer. The officer looked up as he approached, his expression neutral. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his tone polite but detached. The man nodded and placed the folder on the counter. "I'd like to file a formal complaint," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Against 2 of your officers." The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't say anything. He opened the folder and skimmed the document, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he looked up. "Wait here, please. I'll get someone to assist you." The man nodded and stepped back, folding his arms across his chest as he waited. He tried to stay calm, but his heart was racing. He could feel the eyes of other people in the station on him, their curiosity palpable. He kept his gaze fixed on the wall in front of him, refusing to let their stares unsettle him. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man in a suit approached him. He introduced himself as Sergeant Harris, the officer in charge of handling complaints. His demeanor was professional, but there was a hint of skepticism in his eyes as he shook the man's hand. "I understand you have a complaint to file," Sergeant Harris said, gesturing toward a small office off to the side. "Let's step in here so we can discuss it." The man followed him into the office and took a seat across from the desk. Sergeant Harris sat down and opened the folder, reading through the complaint more carefully this time. The man watched him, trying to gauge his reaction, but the sergeant's face gave nothing away. After a few minutes, Sergeant Harris looked up. "This is a serious allegation," he said, his tone measured. "Are you sure you want to proceed with this? These kinds of complaints can be complicated." The man nodded. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "What happened wasn't right, and I want it on record." Sergeant Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll make sure this is processed and investigated. It might take some time, but we'll be in touch if we need any additional information." The man stood up, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He had done what he came to do, but he knew this was far from over. As he left the station and stepped back out into the sunlight, he took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he had taken a stand. And for now, that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and the man heard nothing back from the police department. Life went on as usual, work, errands, the occasional walk around the neighborhood, but the silence from the station weighed on him. He had expected some kind of acknowledgement, even if it was just a form letter saying his complaint was being reviewed. But there was nothing. It was as if his words had disappeared into a void. He tried to stay busy, to keep his mind off the waiting, but it wasn't easy. Every time he saw a police cruiser in the neighborhood, his stomach tightened. He couldn't help but wonder if the officers he had filed the complaint against knew about it, if they were watching him even more closely now. He told himself he was being paranoid, but the thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. One evening, as he was cooking dinner, his phone buzzed on the counter. He wiped his hands on a towel and picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the number. It was the police station. He answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hello?" "Good evening," a woman's voice said on the other end. "This is Officer Martinez from the Internal Affairs Division. I'm calling regarding the complaint you filed. Do you have a moment to discuss it?" The man set down the spoon he was holding and leaned against the counter. "Yes, of course," he said, his pulse quickening. Officer Martinez explained that his complaint had been assigned to her for review. She asked him to go over the details of the encounters again, and he did, sticking to the facts as he had written them in his complaint. She listened without interrupting, occasionally typing in the background. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for sharing that. We take these matters very seriously, and will be conducting a thorough investigation. However, I should let you know that these processes can take time. We'll be in touch if we need any further information." The man nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I understand," he said. "I just want to make sure this is handled properly." "Of course," Officer Martinez replied. "We'll do our best to ensure a fair and impartial review. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." The call ended, and the man stood there for a moment, staring at his phone. He felt a small sense of relief knowing that his complaint was being taken seriously, but the uncertainty still lingered. He had no idea how long the investigation would take or what the outcome would be. All he could do was wait. Over the next few days, he tried to focus on the positives. He had taken a stand, and that was something. He had also reached out to the local civil rights organization, and they had been supportive, offering to help him navigate the process if needed. He even started attending a few community meetings, slowly getting to know his neighbors better. It felt good to be part of something bigger, to know he wasn't alone in this. But despite all that, the waiting was hard. Every day felt like a test of his patience, a reminder of how little control he had over the situation. He knew he couldn't rush the process, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, that nothing would change unless he kept pushing. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he made a decision. He wouldn't just sit back and wait. He would keep speaking up, keep standing up for himself and for others who might be facing similar struggles. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let this moment define him. He was going to keep moving forward, no matter how long it took. Because that's who he was. That's what he had been trained to do. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The man's decision to get more involved in his community began to pay off in small but meaningful ways. At the next neighborhood meeting, he shared his experience with the group, careful to keep his tone calm and factual. To his surprise, several people nodded in understanding, and a few even shared their own stories of similar encounters. It was as if his words had opened a floodgate, and suddenly, the room was filled with voices that had been silent for too long. One woman, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, spoke up. "This isn't right," she said, her voice firm. "We can't let this keep happening. If we don't stand up for each other, who will?" Her words resonated with everyone in the room, including the man. He felt a spark of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference if they worked together. Over the next few weeks, the group began organizing. They reached out to local leaders, held more meetings, and even started a petition calling for better accountability from the police department. The man found himself taking on a leadership role, using his discipline and organizational skills from his military background to help keep things on track. It felt good to be doing something proactive, to be part of a team again. But not everyone was supportive. At one of the meetings, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for years stood up and voiced his opposition. "I don't see what the big deal is," he said, his tone dismissive. "The police are just doing their job. If you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about." The room fell silent, and the man felt a surge of frustration. He stood up, addressing the man directly. "With all due respect, it's not that simple," he said, his voice steady but firm. "When you're constantly treated like a suspect just because of how you look, it wears on you. It's not about doing something wrong, it's about being treated with basic respect and dignity." The room erupted into applause, and even the man who had voiced his opposition looked thoughtful. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. The man knew that changing minds wouldn't happen overnight, but every small step counted. As the weeks went by, the group's efforts began to gain traction. Local media picked up the story, and soon, the man found himself sitting down for an interview with a reporter from the community newspaper. He was nervous at first, but as he spoke, he felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone who had ever felt marginalized or unfairly targeted. The article was published a few days later, and the response was overwhelming. People from all over the city reached out, offering their support and sharing their own stories. The man felt a renewed sense of hope, but he also knew they couldn't stop there. They had to keep pushing, keep fighting for change. One evening, as he was leaving a community meeting, one of the officers from his original encounter drove by in his cruiser. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the man felt a chill run down his spine. But this time, he didn't look away. He held the officer's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As he walked home, he thought about how far they had come. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the community, about standing together and demanding better. And he knew that no matter what happened next, they were stronger together. They had found their voice, and they weren't going to be silenced. The call finally came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The man was at home, sorting through some paperwork, when his phone buzzed. It was Officer Martinez from Internal Affairs. Her tone was professional but carried a hint of urgency. "We've completed the initial phase of our investigation," she said. "We'd like you to come in to discuss the findings and provide any additional information you might have." The man's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course. When would you like me to come in?" "Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., if that works for you," she replied. "I'll be there," he said. The next morning, he arrived at the station early, dressed in the same button-up shirt and slacks he had worn when filing the complaint. He checked in at the front desk and was escorted to a small conference room. Officer Martinez was already there, along with another man in a suit who introduced himself as Lieutenant Daniels, the head of Internal Affairs. The atmosphere in the room was formal but not hostile. Officer Martinez began by summarizing the findings of their investigation. They had reviewed body camera footage from the officers involved, interviewed witnesses, and examined the complaint in detail. The man listened carefully, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Based on our review," Officer Martinez said, "we've determined that the officers' conduct during your encounters did not adhere to department protocols. While they did not violate any specific laws, their approach was unnecessarily confrontational and lacked the professionalism we expect from our officers." The man nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. It was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. "What happens now?" he asked. Lieutenant Daniels leaned forward, his expression serious. "The officers will be required to undergo additional training on de-escalation and community relations. They'll also be placed on a probationary period, during which their conduct will be closely monitored. If there are any further incidents, they will face more severe consequences." The man took a deep breath, processing the information. It wasn't the outcome he had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. "I appreciate the thoroughness of the investigation," he said carefully. "But I have to ask, what's being done to prevent this from happening to someone else?" Lieutenant Daniels exchanged a glance with Officer Martinez before responding. "We're implementing new training programs for all officers, focusing on implicit bias and community engagement. We're also working on improving transparency and accountability within the department. It's a process, but we're committed to making changes." The man nodded again, feeling a small sense of hope. He knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but at least they were acknowledging the problem and taking steps to address it. As the meeting wrapped up, Officer Martinez handed him a copy of the investigation report. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," she said. "Your willingness to speak up is helping us make improvements." The man shook her hand and left the station, the report tucked under his arm. He walked home slowly, his mind racing. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that his complaint had been taken seriously, frustration that the consequences for the officers were so minimal, and hope that the department was finally starting to change. When he got home, he sat down at his kitchen table and read through the report. It was thorough and detailed, but it didn't erase the memory of those encounters. He knew that no amount of paperwork could undo the way he had felt that day, the anger, the humiliation, the sense of being powerless. But as he closed the report and set it aside, he realized something important. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. By speaking up, he had started a conversation, and that conversation was leading to change. He thought about the community meetings, the petition, the media coverage. They had come so far in such a short time, and he knew they couldn't stop now. They had to keep pushing, keep demanding better. That evening, he called a few members of the community group and shared the results of the investigation. They agreed to hold a meeting to discuss next steps. As he hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. And as he sat there, staring at the report on his table, he made a silent promise to himself. He would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. Because that's who he was. That's what he had been trained to do. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The community meeting was packed. Word had spread quickly about the results of the investigation, and people from all over the neighborhood, and even beyond, had come to hear the update. The man stood at the front of the room, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. He had never been one for public speaking, but this was too important to stay silent. He began by summarizing the findings of the investigation, keeping his tone calm and factual. As he spoke, he could see the reactions on people's faces, nodding heads, furrowed brows, the occasional murmur of agreement or frustration. When he finished, he opened the floor for questions. A young woman raised her hand. "What happens now?" she asked. "Is this really going to change anything, or is it just for show?" The man took a deep breath before answering. "It's a start," he said. "But it's up to us to keep pushing. We can't let this be the end of the conversation. We have to hold them accountable and make sure these changes actually happen." Another person spoke up, this time an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. "I've seen a lot of promises over the years," he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. "What makes you think this time will be any different?" The man nodded, understanding the skepticism. "You're right," he said. "Promises are easy to make. But this time, we have something we didn't have before, each other. If we stand together, if we keep speaking up, we can make sure they follow through." The room erupted into applause, and the man felt a surge of hope. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. Over the next few weeks, the group continued to meet, their efforts gaining momentum. They organized a town hall with local leaders, including representatives from the police department, to discuss the changes that were being implemented. The man was one of the speakers, and as he stood at the podium, he felt a sense of pride. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore, he was speaking for his community. The town hall was tense at times, with heated exchanges and tough questions, but it was also productive. The police department committed to regular updates on their progress, and the community group agreed to hold them accountable. It was a small step, but it felt like a turning point. As the weeks turned into months, the man began to see small but meaningful changes. The officers who had harassed him were no longer patrolling the neighborhood, and the new officers who replaced them seemed more approachable and respectful. The department also started hosting community outreach events, something that had been unheard of before. But the man knew they couldn't let their guard down. Real change took time, and there were still plenty of people who resisted it. He continued to attend meetings, to speak out, to push for more. And as he did, he noticed something else: more and more people were joining the cause. What had started as a small group of concerned neighbors had grown into a movement. One evening, as he was walking home from a meeting, he ran into one of the officers who had been at the town hall. The officer nodded politely, and the man returned the gesture. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. They weren't friends, but they weren't enemies either. They were just two people trying to do their part to make the community better. As he reached his house and unlocked the door, he felt a sense of accomplishment. They had come so far, but they still had a long way to go. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But he also knew they were stronger together. And as he sat down on his couch, staring at the blank TV screen, he made a silent promise to himself. He would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. Because that's who he was. That's what he had been trained to do. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. Months had passed since the town hall, and the neighborhood felt different. The tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud had begun to lift. People walked the streets with a little more ease, and the police cruisers that patrolled the area no longer carried the same sense of unease they once had. The man noticed the changes, small as they were, and felt a quiet pride in what he and his community had accomplished. But he knew better than to think the work was done. Real change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And he was determined to keep moving forward. One Saturday morning, the community group organized a neighborhood cleanup event. It was a simple idea: bring people together to pick up litter, plant flowers, and spruce up the area, but it was also symbolic. It was a way to show that they cared about their community, that they were invested in making it better for everyone. The man arrived early, wearing an old t-shirt and a pair of work gloves. He was greeted by familiar faces: the retired teacher who had spoken up at the first meeting, the young woman who had asked tough questions, even the older man who had been skeptical at first. They were all there, ready to pitch in. As they worked, they talked and laughed, sharing stories and ideas. The man found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. It felt good to be part of something positive, to see the tangible results of their efforts. At one point, the retired teacher approached him, a small pot of flowers in her hands. "You know," she said, "I wasn't sure about all this at first. But you've really made a difference." "We all have." The man shook his head modestly. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us. We're stronger together." She smiled and handed him the pot. "Here. Plant these somewhere nice. Let's make this place as beautiful as the people in it." He took the flowers and found a spot near the entrance to the park. As he dug a hole in the soil and carefully placed the plant inside, he thought about how far they had come. It wasn't just about the flowers or the clean streets, it was about the sense of unity, the feeling that they were all in this together. Later that afternoon, as the event was winding down, a police cruiser pulled up to the park. The man tensed for a moment, but then he recognized the officer behind the wheel. It was one of the new officers who had been assigned to the neighborhood. The officer stepped out of the car and walked over, his hands in his pockets. "Hey," the officer said, nodding to the man. "Looks like you've got a good thing going here." The man nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah," he said finally. "We're just trying to make the neighborhood a better place." The officer looked around, taking in the scene, the people laughing, the flowers blooming, the sense of camaraderie. "It's nice to see," he said. "I know things haven't always been easy around here, but it's good to see people coming together." The man studied the officer for a moment, then extended his hand. "Thanks," he said. "We're trying." The officer shook his hand, and for a moment, they stood there in silence. It wasn't a perfect moment, there was still a lot of work to be done, a lot of trust to be built, but it was a start. As the officer drove away, the man felt a sense of hope. They were building something here, something real and lasting. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about creating something new, something better. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun set, he thought about the journey they had been on. It hadn't been easy, and there had been plenty of setbacks along the way. But they had kept going, kept pushing, and now they were starting to see the fruits of their labor. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But he also knew they were ready. They had found their voice, their strength, and their unity. And they weren't going to let anything take that away from them. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, the man stood up and went inside. He had work to do, and he was ready for whatever came next. Because that's who he was. That's what he had been trained to do. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him.